All right, so we are live. We are live on Twitter Spaces as well, and we are live on Twitch. So let's just give it a little bit of time to get started and get some people to join. But this is going to be a very exciting subject, particularly this one, if you can't tell already from the screen, is going to be a fun one. If you aren't already upset with how the government spends your money, get ready to feel very upset about how the government spends your money even more. And we're already talking way in the past. Let's not even talk about right now. But of course, it's 8:27. We're a little early, so we're going to go ahead and get started with the live stream. Welcome back to PM Corner, where we talk about project management skill sets and we also look at past projects to understand why they were a success or a failure. So, today's subject, well, really project management case study, is the FBI's Virtual Case Files project or program, because technically it was split into multiple phases. And we're going to look at what really happened with this one. As I mentioned before, if you weren't upset already about how the government spends your money, get ready for this one. This is such a treat. But before we begin, I do want to say these very quick things. Please give a like, follow, subscribe. Please feel free to donate via the PayPal link that's in the chat. You can also subscribe now to Patreon, where you get more cool things such as my scripts, my presentations that you see, all of that and more. And also, depending on which tier you join, you can also get one-on-one mentoring with me, and that can include tutoring for a very low monthly fee. And of course, it really helps keep the channel going and, continues to provide awesome PM content like this for you all to enjoy. And so with that said, I'm going to quickly show you this timeline. This is very high level. This is not very detailed right now. It is looking at specific moments within this project, okay? And as I said, you're going to get very intrigued by why we spent so much money and it was still not a success. Particularly because we go from one type of project to another. We're talking a lot of scope issues. We're talking a lot of timeline issues. A lot of politics also played a role in this particular program. And it's really unfortunate because it is such a huge and important need, especially for the FBI. The FBI really needs to be on top of things because it's for national security, of course. And, well, it gets a little tough. Now, for those of you that are on Twitch, I don't necessarily see you posting comments, but I will do my best to kind of check here and there. But just hold your comments if you have any, and I will be happy to answer them. If you're on Twitter Space, just feel free to hold on until I give a pause and ask anyone any questions, if they have any questions. So with that said, let's get started. So first and foremost, the project, even though it's called the Virtual Case File Project, it is technically called Trilogy. Now, of course, why did this project begin? Because this is about the birth. So, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, had a very archaic system. It was very manual. You had a lot of paperwork, a lot of note taking, a lot of documenting, and that included who you spoke to, who were your informants, what were your leads, what were your dead ends, what were all the things necessary for an FBI agent to conduct their day to day business. Now, of course, when it was founded, I think it was like 1920s, was even going back that far. You had what you had. Okay, you didn't have the technology to be able to, do all the fancy things we do now, such as having, virtual typing or even speech recognition, where you can talk into a mic and it records everything you say. Right? They didn't have that luxury back then. Okay, but as time progressed, the FBI, even in the early 90s, were starting to have an understanding that they really did need to upgrade their system. After all, it was archaic at that point. So there were multiple efforts. According to some sources, they did try to make many efforts to get this project going and to get it running and to get funding for it. But over like multiple times it was shot down. Congress wasn't seemingly interested, although I don't know why, because, well, that doesn't make sense, especially because this is national security. This isn't just some, random pet fun project, right? You got to take in consideration what the FBI does. Whether we agree with the politics of today or not, we're not going to talk about that as much, but I will say that the politics do play a huge role once we start getting into the project and when it starts from inception. So, of course, finally in September of 2000, the FBI was able to get Congress to approve the project and to approve $380 million. But that was $380 million over 3 years. Now, of course, the initial name of the program was called the FBI Information Technology Upgrade Program. It wasn't VCF, it wasn't Trilogy. It was FBI Information Technology Upgrade Program. So, what this was trying to address was this. There were 13,000 FBI desktop computers that were 4 to 8 years old and could not run modern software. Yikes. That's a little crazy, but that's also not surprising based on my experience with the government. They tend to have very old software in the first place. Not surprising on that note. Communication capabilities, networks between and within the FBI offices were up to 12 years old. Well, that makes sense. Again, if you got old, computers with not as modern software, you're probably going to have old networks, right? Kind of makes you wonder how safe that was and how secure that was. And then most of the FBI network components were no longer manufactured or supported, which makes sense because as we see with technology, right? As time passes, technology grows and advances, it becomes more efficient, better, whatever it is, right? We don't see many people walking around with an iPhone, 7 right now. We're at like, what, iPhone 20 or something? So you can tell that people want to keep up with the latest technology, and someone like the FBI most certainly should be keeping up with the technology of today and continue to keep up with it because, again, and I emphasize this, they are protecting the American people. That is their mission. Another piece is most resident agency offices were connected to the network at speeds equivalent to 56K modems, which again, this is very old. I'm not that technical, so I don't know what that really exactly equates to. But if you're a little more tech savvy, please leave a comment in the chat. Let me know. I'll look at it, of course, when I make a pause. So of course, with that said, agents were unable to rely on emailing each other case related information, which also meant there was not a real way for agents that were working on one case and another agent working on another case to share information and see if there's a commonality between the cases. Is it being conducted by the same suspect, that sort of thing. After all, I know when we look at crime movies or television, right? Things may not, it sometimes is baffling how things could be so interconnected. But in reality, that's kind of truthful when you talk about organized crime. That's why when we talk about like Al Capone and, very famous gangsters and mobsters and mafias, it really is that. And so for the FBI to try and keep, those sorts of people in check and, kind of make sure they don't continue to cause havoc within society, it's pretty difficult when you can't share information amongst yourselves and also be able to access that information without going through major hoops and shoots and ladders and all kinds of craziness just to access it, right? So that brings us to why the program was created. Now, eventually, though, before they obviously put it out in the market and asked, for what is called a request for proposal, which is an RFP. And if you remember in the PMBOK, that's in the chapter for procurement. And when we want to understand a proposal, like who proposes the best solution to something, that is called a request for proposal. So before the FBI put it out, as it seems, they changed the name from the FBI Technology Upgrade Program to the Trilogy Information Technology Modernization Program, or for short, they called it the Trilogy Program. And what they did was they broke it down into three parts. Okay, so the first part was provide 56 FBI field offices with updated computer terminals, new hardware scanners, printers, and servers. Part two was to re implement the FBI intranet and secure in both locally and widely for agents to share information. That's key. And then part three was to replace the FBI's investigative software applications, including their obsolete Automated Case Support System, or ASC system. So those three things are extremely important because as we just looked at the, as to the why, we understand now what the business value was for the program, for the FBI as a whole. Okay. So that, again, that's touching upon initiating, right? So we understand the business value, and that's a really important business value. So there's nothing wrong they did there in that regard. So that obviously means that when they had a project charter, probably drafted up with, whoever we find out next was fortunate enough to do this program, that they had an understanding as to what was the business value. And I'm going to emphasize that because that is a huge component of the project the PMBOK being a project manager is understanding business value, because you always go back to what the business value is. And we're going to see a little bit more when we get further along in the case as well. Now, of course, they had two delivery target dates. Okay, not exact dates, but months and year. So should be a first delivery that would have been provided in December of 2003. Okay, so that was like kind of the first part of it all. And then the completion of the program as a whole was to be completed in June of 2004. Now, understanding initially of the purpose, so they wanted to provide capability to find information in the FBI databases without prior knowledge of its location and search all databases with a single query. Which, again, as I was going back to when I was telling you how it's pretty difficult to share information and figure out, if a suspect is kind of interconnected with multiple other cases that the FBI is investigating. Well, that is one of the initial purposes, is so that they can start to have a better understanding of interconnectivity with some of their, potential suspects, informants even. Because again, you're talking about organized crime. You want to understand how people are communicating, who's communicating where are your informants, where are they getting the information from, who are they getting the information from. And then being able to share that amongst yourselves, again, really makes a difference, because again, you can solve a lot more cases if you now understand that there's potential connectivity. Then the next piece was web to enable the existing investigative applications, improve capabilities to share information internally, externally, as I just emphasized, and allow the evaluations of case and crime patterns using commercial and FBI enhanced analytical and case management tools. And so that's very valid and important as well. And again, that should be also part of the business value, or that should be listed in the benefits management plan, right? Because you have the business case, which is saying the business value, and the benefits management plan is what are we getting out of this, which then creates your project charter to say, why are we doing this? What is the purpose of this? So those items that I just listed are then your benefits that you're going to get from having that improved case file system. Now, of course, there's a couple little additional information about the project. So, of course, we're talking the 2000s. So, if any of you were born in the 90s, let's say, or even in the 80s, let's even go that far back, we've seen technology improve over time. And one of the things was there wasn't, now we have like hybrid cloud, we have AWS full cloud, Azure cloud, Microsoft cloud, Google cloud. You can, if you have a Google account, you can access all kinds of Google products with no problems whatsoever. That could be Google Chat, it could be Google Docs, Google whatever it is, right? And in the 2000s, that kind of wasn't really a thing, if anyone remembers that. Now, I'm not, again, technical savvy. So, if you are, just leave a comment in the, in the chat. Just let me know before when I pause and I can look at it. But of course, they had to improvise their IT infrastructure for more than 50 independent application systems written in different programming languages and running on disparate platforms. So again, you're talking very archaic system. So you have all these different applications that are not probably talking to each other because again, we're not able to share information amongst ourselves. So therefore, if you got one person using this application and then you got to go to a different application to do something else, well then you're not really getting the information to get compiled into one system. And that's what they really wanted to do. So a custom developed system was needed since no existing commercial software packages were available that met the agency's need when the project began in 2001. And this is valid because, again, as I said, anyone who was born even in the 80s knows that we've really seen technology grow. So when we see, when we think back on, projects like, the VCF or Trilogy, we start to kind of think to ourselves, well, man, I mean, we can now just tap tap done. We're in one place and we don't have to go to 20 different applications. I'm sure, if some of us can remember when we had to use AOL, for example, and how, you couldn't really use the phone if you were on the internet because then it would interrupt the connection, right? I'm sure a lot of people understand that. So imagine then having to protect your country and you don't have a real way of doing that in the first place. And so that is the birth of Trilogy. So I'm going to pause for a second and I'm just going to check and see if there's any questions in the chat, which I don't at the moment. So we're just going to go ahead and continue on then. So now we talk about the inception and the progress or the events of the Trilogy VCF project. Okay. So in May 2001, the first two parts of the project. So remember, there's three parts to the trilogy. Okay, so part one was the updating computer terminals, hardware, scanners, printers, servers, right? Then part two was re-implement the FBI internet and secure it both locally and widely for agents. And then the third part was to replace the FBI's investigative software applications, including the ASC system or the automated case support system. Okay. But so in May 2001, parts 1 and 2 were awarded to DynCorp, which later merged with CSC. And they're not really the big focus from my research. So I didn't really see a whole lot about what they did and how things worked for them and how they were able to, do things and so forth. It just seemed like that wasn't that big of a deal, quote unquote. Although I do have my own professional opinion of how they approach the work, but we're going to get into that because in June of 2001, the third part of Trilogy, which is the replacement of the ASC system, was awarded to Science Applications International Corporation, also known as SIAC, for the 3-year period, right? So during the 3-year period, you had part one, part two, and part three technically going at the same time. That's what I could gather from reading about the project. It didn't explicitly state that. But if I were to be a betting woman, I'm going to bet that they kind of had to do that a lot more in parallel. Just because you're talking 3 years, I mean, that's a. If you really were to think about replacing an entire archaic system, that doesn't really, that's not a short endeavor. And if you're trying to also replace and upgrade your hardware, your softwares, and everything else, you kind of need to do that in parallel. But that's problematic in itself. But moving on. So of course, SIAC was awarded the third part of Trilogy to create the new case management system. Now, of course, that was in June of 2001. A really big major event happened in 2001 as well. And if you don't remember, or if you weren't born around that time, or if you were born after, and you may have heard about it, but this is when, so we're talking June of 2001. So not even close to 3 months later we get the 9/11 attacks. So 9/11 happens. The week before 9/11 occurs, which I failed to mention, so the FBI director at the time when Trilogy was put into place was Louis Freeh. And on September 4th of 2001, Louis Freeh was replaced by Robert S. Mueller III as the FBI director. And his intent was to accelerate the Trilogy program. Don't know why in the first place, but it pretty much gets compounded when 9/11 occurs. And so the 9/11 attacks occur, and of course, it's a very devastating day. It's a very horrible, horrendous moment. If you ever want to read and kind of see what the government kind of discovers and all that stuff, you can read the 9/11 Commission's report. Very difficult to read, I will definitely say, because as I was doing research for this particular program, it was really hard for me to kind of get through because they did talk about the events that occurred on the plane that they could tell from, obviously when they were making the calls, when they were doing the radio silence and all that fun jazz. Um, so, of course, that occurs, and the FBI is kind of on the hot seat at that point because, again, they're protecting our national security. They're the ones that are supposed to kind of know this stuff. And one of the many pieces of the FBI is counterterrorism. So they were kind of in the hot seat because they really didn't know that Al Qaeda was planning all this stuff and planning these attacks and who was doing what and boarding onto what plane at what time and all that fun jazz. So they had no idea. And so, of course, they were under a lot of scrutiny. And of course, their technology being under scrutiny too, because obviously the FBI knew their technology is obsolete. So Congress found that their timeline of 3 years was unacceptable politically, which leads to even bigger problems for this program as a whole. So you get a change in priorities and requirements. That's the first part that comes right after 9/11. So Mueller brings in this guy named Robert Ciardio. I don't think I pronounced his name right. Don't come at me. I don't. So he was an agent that was in charge of the Tampa, Florida field office, and Mueller brought him in to be the executive assistant director of the administration. So, of course, Mueller's plan, he wants to accelerate the program, get it going. And already Congress is like, yup, get it going, get it started. We need to do this. This is important. And so Chiardio believed that the current plans for adding a web interface to the ACS or the ASC system was not going to provide value to the FBI agents. So he was kind of looking into things, looking how things, are being done and so forth, which, that's kind of a good thing because you kind of need to understand what the program's about, right? Which we'll talk about when I get to my mentor moment. But of course, because Chiardio had his own ideas, he then brings in Special Agent Larry Depew in October of 2001. Now, Depew is essential to this in the fact that, in my opinion, he was one of the many other factors as to why VCF was a very big failure for the FBI. So Depew was brought in because he had developed his own database system to track Russians and mafia mobsters in New Jersey in the 1990s. So, of course, you would think that someone who did that, one time, is brought in as thought of being a technical expert. Big problem right there. So, of course, once he brought Depew in, Ciardio and Depew convinced Mueller that the FBI needed an entirely new system that could store millions of records and allow agents to analyze relationships on everything from witnesses, suspects, and informants to evidence, which, of course, again, that was the whole business value in the first place. So, right there, the fact that they had to reiterate that is a little bit concerning because and again, this will be part of a mentoring moment, is that you can bring people onto a program that have their own agenda at times. And that can happen. And you're going to see that a little bit. It does actually happen, more particularly though with Depew, but we're going to get into that in a minute. So of course, because of Ciardio and Depew's convincing of Mueller to completely redo the system in December of 2001. So the contract's awarded in June 2001. So 9/11 occurs. So that's not even 3 months. So then not even 6 months later, the FBI has asked SIAC to stop building the web-based front end for the old programs and was asked to devise a new case management. Yeah. When you change scope like that, you're going to run into a lot of problems. And oh, by the way, the FBI does ask for money multiple times. And I'm going to say this. It's one thing to ask for money because you realize that, something needed to really change. When you start consistently asking for more money because you're not doing things well, there's a very big difference. So we're going to see that as we continue on. So as part of this change, they also did timeline and acceleration changes. So they made changes to scope. They've now made changes to schedule. So in the early 2000s, and a lot of the sources really couldn't be specific on when SIAC and the FBI committed to this, but in early 2022, or in early 2002, not 2022, we're in that year. In early 2002, SIAC and the FBI committed to creating an entirely new case management system in 22 months. That's a little over almost close to 2 years. That's very accelerated, especially because how do you know how your system works? And that's going to get pointed out later too, because another very important person comes along that kind of plays a role and kind of brings a lot of this to light, to be honest. But of course, things don't work out well for him. So, of course, in January of 2002, in addition to committing to that 22-month timeline, the FBI also requested an additional $70 million to accelerate the project. So already we are at 380 million. Add another 70. But guess what? Congress went beyond the 70 million. Congress approved 78 million additional funds for this project. And so, of course, this is where we get VCF, which is the virtual case files, which is going to replace the ASC system. So VCF would contain major new application database and graphical user interface. And in committing to the 22-month timeline, the scope of Trilogy, or really of VCF, grew by 80% from the initial project baseline. Okay, so again, when you start adding scope, in the scope management chapter of the PMBOK, we talk about scope creep. Now, I'm not saying that the FBI did not have the right to kind of stop things and say, you know what, we need to adjust the priorities. I think that was a good initial thought. But the way they went about it, not so much. So when you start messing with scope and you start messing with schedule, you gotta have some problems. Remember, the iron triangle, scope, cost, and schedule. If one of those is out of whack, everything else is out of whack. No ifs, ands, or buts. Now, the thing is that they did have integration challenges for the VCF system because SIAC broke their teams into 8 different teams. And when you don't have teams communicate, what ends up happening? They become siloed. They do their own thing. They're not communicating. So they're not telling other teams what they're doing. They're not telling other teams what they're changing. You name it. Big problem right there. Come along more scope issues. So remember our buddy Depew? Yeah, so Depew proceeds to take a more cavalier approach to systems developing by taking a number of shortcuts in terms of planning and developing the blueprints that would guide critical decisions. Now, again, Depew was not tech savvy in any way. I mean, the guy built a database in the 1990s. How old and archaic is his mindset? You kind of have to kind of wonder. And this is where we also have to understand that we have people who get put into positions that they have no business being in. And so one of the things that Depew says is the development team began to quote unquote feel our way in the dark as there were no guidelines or documentation mapping for the FBI's processes and IT infrastructure. Big problem right there. And we're going to talk about that more in the mentoring moment. But initially, just understand this. As part of discovery for any new project, once you understand business value, fine, you know what the business value is. But as part of planning, the first and most important thing is scope identification. What are your requirements? What are we dealing with? What are we having? What challenges are we facing? What kind of risks are we going to deal with? You name it. And this is why the planning phase is one of the most important phases of project management, because even when you're agile, right, you still need to plan. And that even includes your framework, because you need to understand how everything works so that everything can work together as a cohesive whole. As part of integration management chapter, the project manager is the integrator. So you as a project manager have to integrate all these moving parts, and that includes the agile aspect. It includes how to plan, how to prepare, what the risks are, etc. And the fact that they had to feel their way in the dark already right there is a big problem. Never mind the fact the guy was cutting also corners in every single way possible. So, due to the 22-month delivery schedule, the SIAC and the FBI committed to taking a risky implementation strategy called flash cutover. Now, I've never really heard of this, even though I've been in the IT industry for a while, but that sounds pretty scary, and it is actually scary. So, this is what they mean by the flash cutover. The meaning is that the agents, so FBI agents, would be, they come into work, la di da, do their thing, have, spend what, however many hours they're working in their system, right? But then they would log off before going home. And when they came back the next day, or let's say they did it over a weekend, there would be a new system there. But here's the problem with it. What it meant, though, was that there was no backup plan if something went wrong. And there was no going back to the old system if nothing worked. So imagine you come in the next day or after a weekend and you try to log in and you can't even do anything. And there's no way of going back. Yeah, kind of problematic in itself. I'm going to pause for a second. Does anyone have any questions for me so far? I see one viewer, but I just want to make sure. I don't see any questions, and I don't see any questions on the Twitter space either. So we're going to keep going. So all right, we're really we're coming down the spiral problems of poor project management, as we can tell, but it just gets better. It just gets better over time. So Mueller and Ciardio, the guy who brings on Depew, hires C.Z. Higgins, also known as Sherry Higgins, who was a seasoned IT professional, to create the Office of Program Management. Okay, cool, great. So someone who's got an idea of how technology should work, great. Here comes the next problem. Higgins names Depew, which again, no IT project management experience, no real understanding of information technology as a whole. She names him the VCF project manager. Great job. People with no business being in the roles they're in being put right in the roles of where they have no business being in. Fantastic. So, of course, as part of the scope issues, in addition to the fact that you have Depew over here doing his thing, being Wild Wild West cowboy, and then you got the fact that the FBI didn't believe in really developing formal requirements. Ah, so imagine the amount of scope creep you're going to face. When you don't have formal requirements, you're going to have a lot of scope creep. That's in the scope management chapter. They talk about scope creep. So then, of course, after 6 months of exhaustive joint application development sessions, they had a very detailed requirements document. But again, they also didn't want to have a formal development process. So what that meant is that they would make initial requirements. So in traditional project management, people will first detail plan out everything. That also includes scope, right? So every piece of scope is planned out in the beginning. Even if you were progressively elaborating, which is also talked about in the PMBOK, and it's under the project management framework section, right? You still plan things up front, even if you did progressive elaboration where you kind of, detail plan out a small chunk of time and then you go to the next one. Because unlike in Agile, where we say in Scrum specifically, right, we're going to plan in small increments. So every 2 weeks, you're detail planning out what is your scope for an epic. Whereas with progressive elaboration, in my honest opinion, though, some project managers might come at me and be like, no, you're wrong, but that's a little more flexible than saying, supply chain management's project management, for example, where everything has to be planned up front because you need to know how much supplies you need, materials, etc. With progressive elaboration, it just wasn't as defined in terms of how long of a period you plan out or how long of a period you wait till your next planning session, right? You kind of have a little more flexibility, but of course, sometimes people don't implement that properly. And that's where we get Agile. Agile tends to really define how things are done. But of course, doing the 6 months exhaustive JAD sessions, I mean, you only get one document and that's it. And then you're just looking at just this particular set of requirements. How is that not going to prevent scope creep? Beats me, but it happens. So, of course, combining the ASC system with the FBI Central Repository Investigative Records and Data. So, that was part of this requirement, was combining the system with the central repository, but they don't go into much detail after that about that specific area. But in the summer of 2002, SIAC had about 200 programmers and was looking to add more people. Now here comes the next person. Now this guy, though, unfortunately, I don't want to say he was necessarily a whistleblower, but you can kind of put him in that sort of category. So SIAC hires Matthew Payton to be part of the security team to review the design documents describing VCF's overall structure, logic, and user interface. So Patton is a big to-do. Now, if you kind of understand cybersecurity or not, even if you don't, here's just the quick and dirty of it. Cybersecurity not only is about securing the system, it's also understanding how the system works in order to secure it. So if I have a system where I'm trying to share information about cases with someone else and I don't want people to kind of know that we kind of share the same suspect, how is cybersecurity going to implement certain security strategies to ensure that information doesn't get leaked out or hackers don't get, the ability to access the information, etc., etc. So what happens is as Payton's working, Payton soon realized that SIAC was not interested in his opinions and not to rock the boat when he began expressing concerns regarding potential security and design issues. Because again, as part of a cybersecurity analyst, you're understanding how the system works in order to secure it. And this guy was going, hold up, wait a minute, something ain't right. What's going on here? Hey, there's some issues. SIAC wasn't interested, which that's going to be another mentoring moment. So, of course, Patton Payton also complained that SIAC made no attempts to control cost with the 200 programmers who were staffed to make work, quote unquote, when only a couple dozen would have been sufficient. So this guy was not only a cybersecurity analyst in some way, shape, or form. This guy was also recognizing that, SIAC was just milking the money that they were getting from the FBI, which comes as no surprise. And of course, he's like, wait, so we're not even trying to control our costs. We're not even concerned about the security and design issues. And you already have like more programmers than you need, and you're just making work for the sake of work. And I have had experience on programs where that was kind of a thing, even today. So that does happen where you get people to just create work for the sake of creating work because they're going to take money. Which, of course, you also will hear them say, well, we're trying to keep under, we're trying to meet, our organization's goals, but then we also want to just make sure that we spend all the money for the government because then they can justify getting more money. Imagine that. So, of course, because he was not being listened to, Peyton wasn't being listened to at all. Poor dude. He posted his concerns to InfoSec News about his security concerns with Trilogy and wanted to get in touch with someone at the FBI who would care and demand accountability from its contractors. Yeah, makes sense, but he he did the wrong thing. And that is, he went outside. And I don't know if InfoSec News is outside. It sounds like it is. But Sherry Higgins, the one who's hired, yeah, she saw the messages and reported Peyton to the FBI. And so, of course, what ends up happening is that Peyton gets questioned about breaching national security and his top secret clearance requirements. Now, I don't know if you know this, but top secret clearances, I mean, you think they want to know everything about you. I mean, never mind the fact they want to know the color of your underwear. They want to get as deep as they can. I mean, you might as well just strip in front of them and just let them go, yep, we know who you are. That's how deep and invasive a top security clearance is. So the fact that the FBI was already going, dude, what are you doing? Like, you're breaching national security over here, which you would think they would care about the security of their system, right? But you're concerned about someone, going online and talking about it. Go figure. So of course, unfortunately, Peyton has his security clearance revoked, and he ended up leaving his programming job after 3 months from posting that post. Then, as we continue on later in the year, in December of 2002, Higgins asked for an additional ready. So we start at $380 million. The first ask for money was 78 million additional dollars. Higgins goes to Congress to ask for an additional $137.9 million. Yeah, $137.9 million more. The Inspector General in the government issues a report that describes a lack of critical IT investments and management processes that contributed to the missed milestones and uncertainties about cost, schedule, and technical goals. Because when Higgins is going, hey, I kind of need a little more money, the Inspector General's like, well, hold up. Like, there's something wrong here. Nothing's getting done well. We're seeing milestones being missed, and there's a lot of vagueness about what's the cost and the schedule and the goals. But unfortunately, Congress approves more money anyways, undeterred from the Inspector General making that report. But they don't give the 137.9 million, they give 123.2 million. Still a lot of money. In 2003, afterwards, there were 400 change requests that were filed. Yes, 400 change requests. What is a change request? In integration management, we talk about the integrated change control process. A change request is where you say, hey, I need to make a change due to the following reasons, which meant that you evaluated the scope, schedule, and cost impacts. You understand if there's additional risks or not. You've done an evaluation basically. And though we don't want to necessarily say that making a change request is a bad thing, it's not, it becomes a bad thing when it's a lot. 400 change requests for a single program like that is really ridiculous. And again, it's kind of an indicative um, fact that that means you've got a lot of problems. Now, of course, the sources that mentioned this, they did say some had minor impacts while others had major impacts. I mean, overall, if you're constantly making a change request, you got problems. Your program's not really well managed because the integrated change control process is not meant for you to just willy-nilly change things at will. That's not the point. The point of it is to make changes when necessary. And even in the PMBOK, or if you read the RITAs that, simplifies the language better, you understand that integrated change control is essential, but it is not something you just abuse, okay? But of course, as you can tell, 400 change requests in 1 year is quite abusive. I didn't do the math on that one, and it wasn't really specific at, if it was like in the middle of the year or at specific times. It was just kind of all throughout 2003. So, of course, by the end of 2003 in December, SIAC does the first delivery. So, if you remember back here, we had the two estimated deliveries, right? We had the December 2003 and the December of 2004 for the completion. Okay, December 2003 was the estimated first delivery. SIAC does meet the first delivery timeline. However, when they go to present it to the FBI so that they can evaluate it and accept it, the application was not fully functional, and so of course the FBI did not accept it. And then what ended up happening is the FBI revised the schedule for VCF deployment because of it, and the FBI announced that in June of 2004 that development would split into two parallel tracks, which one was initial operational capability, or IOC, and full operational capability, FOC. Now, there was a case study that did look into this from a more technical perspective, and they talked about the chaos, which Chaos did this research into the success and failures and the number of completed projects, but that were over budget, that were IT. So imagine the fact that we get to first delivery in 2003 per schedule, per estimated timeline, and we didn't get acceptance. In 2004 as a whole, for technical projects, only 39% were successful, 18% were completed but over budget, behind schedule, and not meeting requirements, and 53% were canceled before completing. That is huge, okay? That is a big to do, especially for 2004. But again, we also have to acknowledge technology was different at the time. It wasn't the same, unlike now. But it is what it is. So now I'm going to kind of pause again. If anyone has any questions for me regarding what we've covered so far, I still don't see any questions whatsoever. So we're going to keep going. I don't see it on Twitter Space either. So now we're going into the abandonment of Trilogy and the birth of Sentinel. So Sentinel, I'm going to be honest, I didn't get too deep into kind of researching Sentinel because after reading how much of a cluster Trilogy was, I don't think I could even handle. Actually, I can't even begin to describe that Sentinel was also just quite a show of its own. So of course, when we're talking about trilogy, right? The project was eventually abandoned in April of 2005 after cost estimating over 170 million. That's a lot of money to blow. And so per the 2005 audit report done by OIG, the Office of the Inspector General, the FBI expected to enter into a contract by April 30th of 2005. So they were planning to abandon first their VCF program or trilogy, and we're expecting to go into another contract per the OIG's February 2005 audit report. They were expected to be part of the FICMS program, which was to provide a case management system that was off the shelf for the Department of Homeland Security. And then the FBI thought they could kind of get in on that a little bit. Didn't see much about that afterwards, though. That was only from a couple sources. But if we then go looking at the OIG status report of Sentinel, which that came, if I remember, it was like in 2010, but the links are provided, and at the end I'll show you, what my sources are and where I got the information from. But as part of the OIG report, they kind of talk about it, and I'm not going to lie, it was quite funny to read because you could tell the FBI just did not learn their lesson the first time. So, March 2006, Mueller announces Sentinel, which is a four-phased, four-year project intended to fulfill the purposes that VCF should have done. So again, Sentinel was a four-phased project. The estimated cost for Sentinel was $425 million. The estimated completion date was December 2009, and the contractor that was doing Sentinel was not SIAC, but Lockheed Martin Services Incorporated, also known as Lockheed Martin. And this project was to be completed in 4 overlapping phases. So it wasn't just 4 phases like back to back. We're talking 4 phases that overlapped each other, and they would last between 12 to 16 months. And so thinking about that, trying to speed up your schedule again, you already did that before with Trilogy, VCF, and you failed. You will even abandon your own project. So you try it again. That's like trying to do the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result every single time. It's hilarious. But of course, phase 1 of the Sentinel was deployed on June 19th of 2007, and what happened is they gained lessons learned from phase 1, which caused them, meaning the FBI and Lockheed Martin, to replan their other 3 phases, which led to, again, more money. Now, I won't say it was necessarily as bad, it's not, I don't want to say bad, not as high as Trilogy, but the original estimation was 425 million. They increased it to 451 million based on when they made this reevaluation. So then prior to another audit, so OIG, the Office of Inspector General, they kept really monitoring this program. So certain programs within the government, just as an FYI, tend to get monitored if they are ones of national security, if they're ones of really high dollar value and high value to Congress, to the White House, etc. So if they're starting to show that they can't do their job or they can't do their part or something's going on, OIG will continuously audit them. So OIG had another audit report on them in March of 2010, where it mentions that at first the FBI did a partial stop work to Lockheed Martin on portions of Phase 3, and all of phase 4 due to performance issues, usability, and quality of work delivered. Which eventually, and it was mentioned later on in the same report, that changed from being a partial, only portions of phase 3 for then all of phase 3 and 4. And then, as of August 1st, 2010, mentioned in the same report, the FBI had not decided on an approach and did not give the Office of Inspector General, OIG, any details on the description of alternatives for completing Sentinel. And that was mentioned in their 2010 report. Now, I did kind of do a little bit of browsing. I didn't research. I just kind of did browsing because, again, just Sentinel was another proof that FBI didn't really learn their lesson. But there was another later OIG audit report where they mentioned that they were looking at agile practices. So they did eventually complete Sentinel, and that was in July of 2002. So 2.5 to 3 years late because their original date was in 2009. Imagine that. Did they learn their lesson the first time? No. You could tell. All fun and games. I'm going to pause again just one more time to see if there's any questions, and I don't see anything, so now is a mentor moment. So, a lot to cover. A lot of interesting information, really interesting timeline. As I said during that whole entire lecture, you have the PM triangle, which is scope, cost, and schedule. Even though PMI wants to say everything's impacted, which is including the risk, the quality, blah, 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 blah. When either scope, cost, and or schedule goes out of whack, it doesn't matter what happens to the other because the others will be impacted anyways, right? So, for example, if you don't do your due diligence in the scope analysis, which is huge, by the way, whether you're traditional, hybrid, or agile, you need to understand your scope. Now, again, I'm not even going to harp on the fact that the FBI definitely understood their business value. They definitely did. But the way they went about it, in my honest opinion, just reading and understanding this project as a whole, they should have really just made the case management system first. Because how are you going to connect? And again, I'm not very technical, but I can kind of put two and two together sometimes. Okay. How are you going to connect your new laptops, internet, the intranet, networks? How are you going to connect it to a case file system that you don't know about? Meaning you don't know how it works, you don't know how it's going to function, you don't know its design, you don't know how it's going to ingest data. How are you going to connect all those other things to it? So while yes, they should have upgraded the laptops, and okay, fine, I guess you can't really say, well, it's not like they were doing things one at a time. They were trying to do everything again parallel, which if you have to force things to be done in parallel, you really need to have a reevaluation of your scope or your program as a whole. And that's essential. Um, Another thing too that is that you saw a lot of scope creep happening. You already had Depew, who was feeling his way in the dark with his own team on the government side, the FBI side. So you kind of have to wonder, like, was this guy really documenting any of the processes, anything that they were discovering? It wouldn't be far-fetched if it was a solid no. So of course that leads to a lot of issues with your requirements. So you get a lot of lack of requirements. In addition to that, when you have a lack of requirements, which means you also don't have a baseline to go, oh wait, we need to make a change. Again, with integrated change control, you then end up with a lot of scope creep. And that was huge scope creep. You had Chiardio and Depew going to Mueller saying, oh, well, instead of doing what we originally planned, we just need to make a whole entire new case system, which was part of it, but it threw everything off. And as mentioned, like you had an 80% scope increase. That is insane. And there was no way you were going to get that done in 22 months. I don't care if you were Superman. You won't. You can't. It's not realistic. And this is where it's very important as project managers. You know, we tend to be the smart people in the room that people want to hire, but instead of allowing the smart people to tell them how to do things to help them achieve their business value, they're the ones telling the project managers how they want things done, which doesn't work. Because if you already knew what to do and how to address your business value, why did you hire a project manager? Why did you hire a third party? Makes no sense. But of course, people are like, well, because, maybe they need expertise. Okay, well, you can just hire contractors. You didn't need to hire a whole program management team if that be the case, right? But this also leads to the fact that SIAC, wasn't really saying no because they were just getting a lot of money. And as mentioned with Peyton, right, you had a contractor who was burning up money like it was growing on trees. Like there was just a fountain right outside coming from the FBI. Money, money, money flowing out just flowing. That stopped. And they weren't meeting the requirements because, that's kind of partially, it's not really partially SIAC's fault. It's the FBI and SIAC's fault. They didn't really work together to really ensure that they built the scope and they planned out the scope in a way where it aligned with the business value and fulfilled the needs of the FBI. But in addition to that, as I mentioned, 9/11 was a huge impact to this program as a whole. So here's some key takeaways that I'm going to give you, Padawan. So the first thing is that the contractor, when winning the proposal and coming in, should have said, yeah, your two other phases are important, but we really need to really understand what it is this case management system is supposed to do to fulfill the business value, to fulfill your business case and benefits management plan. So we need to understand your processes, how are you documenting things, and so forth. It's not like sources weren't saying that there wasn't, some kind of standardized form that the FBI agents were filling out. That wasn't true. They did have that. So it's not like there wasn't something there. But unfortunately, like a lot of places I've seen, they don't document their processes well. But that should have been a golden opportunity for SIAC, to say, hey, we really need to plan this out right and well if we want to meet this really short timeline. So we need to understand what needs to go on. This is also part of discovery where, you've got engineers, looking into the, you know, the system itself, how old is it, how archaic it is, and evaluate what really needs to happen and change. Now, of course, again, and I remember someone on TikTok saying, people who get the PMP, for example, they always seem to screw things up. Well, you can say that about anyone. At the end of the day, and you've probably seen this in your career at some point where you're just looking at someone and going, how in the world are you in your role? Like Depew, there are people who have no business being in the roles that they're put in. And this is something that even the PMBOK talks about and it's a basic psychology concept of the halo effect, where someone just seems so smart, savvy, go down the list of fantastic attributes, and the first thing they think is, oh, they're a great manager. No. Just like not everyone can be a parent, not everyone can be a manager. Like, there are just people who are not fit to be in that kind of role, but they end up being in those roles because they're smart. So, like in Depew's case, he was put in his role because he just happened to do one time in the 90s setting up some database to track down Russians and mobsters. Yeah, like that really shows true IT experience and project management, right? No. Again, too, this is also the same. Just because someone can't seems like they're capable doesn't always mean they are. In addition to this, and these kind of go hand in hand, no amount of money is worth the headache and potential damage that you as a contractor will face if things were to go really bad. So if you remember in the Challenger space shuttle, where that company, who was it? I think it was Thornrink or whatever. I can't remember right off the top of my head. But do you see them around now because of what happened? No. Their reputation was damaged. That was it. They were done. Nothing. No more. We don't hear about them. They're gone. So, same thing with SIAC. Why would you want to take on that kind of reputation damage that you're kind of a money grubbing, non requirement making yes man? And I've seen this too way too many times. You get these project managers, they come in and they're all smoke and mirrors to the client, right? So everything is smoke and mirrors. They're saying, "Oh yeah, we can do this great thing and that great thing, and oh yeah, yeah, you want that? Yes, we will give it to you." And then you're going, "Wait, is this realistic? Is this Does this fulfill the business value? Is it aligned with the business value? Is this scope creep? Have we evaluated if this, has major impacts?" And it is a more of a selling point for them to, of course, make the client go, "Oh yeah, here's more money." And in addition, they later go and they just tell their worker bees, "Just do it." I've seen that too many times. And it never works out, ever. As we saw with SIAC, they never got the VCF working. They never got it to happen. Which leads into the final thing about my mentoring moment is that it's okay to say no. I know a lot of people sit there when I say that and they're like, "Oh no, I don't know if I could say no to a client." Well, even the PMBOK says you can say no to your client. The PMBOK clearly states that when scope is not aligned with the business value, you have the right to completely and utterly say no. Well, and the phrase too is, "Well, this looks like this is another project, not my project, not the current one." But then there is a point where some stakeholders are very insistent on what they want. I mean, you probably in your career, or maybe not even your career, like you could even see it at Starbucks. You get people who are so persistent in wanting all these extra goodies and things, but they never want to pay more for it. And that's where you kind of have to go, "No, you either pay for this or it's not happening." Or it's, "No, we're not going to do it because it's not aligned with the business value. This is a great afterwards, but this is not aligned with the current business value." But that doesn't happen because people get, well, greedy. Now, of course, some people will be like, "Oh, well, you're just not savvy enough to understand that you need to make money." Well, no, I understand you need to make money. But, no amount of money to have your reputation damaged and just not be just a yes man is worth it. So, with that said, I'm going to open the floor up now for any questions from anyone on the Twitter space and or Twitch. But I don't see much conversation happening on either end anyways. But, I thought I'd give the opportunity. Now, I will reemphasize again, if you do have questions, feel free to message me, via Patreon, Twitter, Twitch, even TikTok, YouTube, wherever. If you really like the content that's being made on this channel, please feel free to support it. You can either donate directly to PayPal or you can subscribe to Patreon, where again, Patreon has a lot more cooler things. So you get to know in advance, and I'm going to give you some of the benefits. So if you sign up with Patreon, you get the benefit of knowing in advance what my topics are going to be about. I don't now share what the topics are because I want to bring intrigue. If you're a patron, you will know on that week what is the subject. So, kind of an FYI, first off. Secondly, you'll get my materials that I use for these streams. So then you can have them for yourself. You can look at also my sources. You can see where I'm getting my information from. So a lot of transparency. And there's a tier where if you want mentorship or if you want even tutoring to prepare for your next role or to get the PMP, certification, you can with just subscribing on Patreon, you get that additional benefit as well. So if you really like this content, please feel free to support the channel. Now I'm just going to finalize in sharing the sources. And again, if you're a patron on Patreon, you can actually download the sources from Patreon and have them on record for yourself even and go look at what I read as well. So, with that said, I really appreciate everyone's time. This has been a really great particular subject. Again, if you now feel like, wow, the government really wastes money, here you go. Another prime example of government wasting money. But if you enjoy this content, I hope you did. I'm glad that you could join, and I'm signing off now. And of course, as a final reminder, this is the final stream for the year. We will pick back up in January. So if you follow me on Twitter, you'll know ahead of time when will be the next Twitch stream for 2023. So I will leave off with a Happy New Year. Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, have a great time, enjoy yourself, and I will see you all next year.